On a quiet afternoon in July 1993, in the low farmland of the Merrimack River Valley in southern Missouri, Luther Finch was sitting on his porch while the water began to rise. It did not arrive all at once, not in a single violent surge the way people later described it, but slowly, steadily, like something that had already decided where it was going, long before anyone noticed it moving, and the fields beyond his fence line began to disappear first at the edges, the low grass flattening under a thin sheet of water that reflected the gray sky before deepening into something heavier, darker, more certain with every passing minute. Across the fence to the north, Raymond Cole was moving quickly, faster than Luther had ever seen him move in all the years they had been neighbors, pulling equipment toward higher ground, shouting instructions to his son, the sound of urgency carrying clearly across the open space between their properties. And beyond that, further down the valley, there were other movements. Other farms reacting, doors opening and closing, engines turning over, people stepping into a situation they did not yet fully understand, but already knew they were behind. Luther did not move. He sat with his hands resting lightly on his knees, his boots planted flat against the wooden boards of the porch, his eyes fixed not on the rising water itself, but on the ground just ahead of it. On the way, the first thin currents touched the edge of his property and hesitated for a moment as if deciding what to do next, because something about the way it moved was different. Not dramatic, not obvious, but different in a way that only someone who had watched this same ground through 40 seasons of rain and runoff would recognize, the kind of difference that did not announce itself, but revealed itself slowly, quietly, if you knew where to look. The water reached the northern boundary, and then, instead of pushing forward, it shifted. It turned. Not completely. Not all at once, but enough that the line of movement changed direction, bending slightly eastward before continuing forward again, as if it had encountered something unseen beneath the surface, something guiding it, redirecting it without resistance. And for a moment, just a moment, it looked like coincidence, like nothing more than the natural variation of a floodplain under pressure. But Luther's eyes did not leave that line, because he knew exactly what the water had just found, and more importantly, he knew where it was going next. Across the field, Raymond shouted again, louder this time, the sound edged with something that had not been there before, something closer to strain than urgency, and Luther could see the difference now in the way the man moved, not just fast but uncertain, reacting instead of deciding. The kind of movement that comes when a situation is already ahead of you and gaining distance. The water rose another inch, then another. It spread wider now, filling the low ground, pushing toward the structures that had stood dry through every season until this one, and for the first time since it began, there was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when the direction of the flood seemed unpredictable, when the surface shifted in overlapping currents that made it difficult to tell where the force was strongest, where it would break next, where it would settle. And still, Luther did not move. Not because he did not understand what was happening, but because he did. He had seen this before. Not like this, not at this scale, not with this much water moving this fast, but the pattern beneath it, the way it gathered, the way it chose its path, the way it pressed against the land until the land gave it direction. That part was familiar to him in a way it was not to anyone else watching it for the first time. The water reached the first rise before his barn. It slowed, just slightly. Enough that someone who was not looking for it would have missed it entirely. But it slowed, and then it shifted again, this time more clearly, this time with purpose, turning away from the barn instead of toward it, following a line that was not visible from where Raymond stood, not visible from the road, not visible from anywhere except here, from this porch. From this exact angle, where the ground revealed what had been done to it years before and what it was now doing in return. Luther leaned back slightly in his chair. Not relaxed, not relieved, just steady, as if he had been waiting not for the flood itself, but for this exact moment, this exact movement, this confirmation that something set in motion long before this day had not changed, had not failed, had not been undone by time or weather or doubt. Because 4 years earlier, on a summer morning that no one else remembered the way he did, Luther Finch had started something that had never really been tested. Not like this. And as the water continued to rise and the fields beyond his fence line disappeared completely beneath it, one question remained, quiet but unavoidable, hanging over everything that was happening in that moment. Not whether the flood would reach his barn, but whether what he had built all those years ago would be enough to stop it. 3 weeks earlier, on a humid evening in June 1993, in the same stretch of land that now lay under moving water, Luther Finch stood at the edge of his field with a small radio in his hand, listening to a weather report that, to anyone else, sounded routine, measured, cautious in the way official voices tend to be when they are not yet ready to say what they suspect might be coming. The report spoke of sustained rainfall across the Midwest, of rising river levels, of upstream accumulation that had not yet translated into immediate danger, but was being monitored closely. And the tone suggested concern without urgency, the kind of concern that allows people to continue with their routines because nothing in the language demands that they stop. Luther switched the radio off before the segment ended. Because the radio was not what had his attention. The ground did. He stood there for a long moment, looking across the field, not at the grass or the fence line or the distant tree break, but at the subtle changes that had taken place over the past 10 days. The kind of changes that do not register all at once, but build quietly until they reach a point where they cannot be ignored by anyone who has spent enough time paying attention. The soil was holding water in a way it had not held it since 1982, not just wet, but saturated beneath the surface, the kind of saturation that removes the ground's ability to absorb anything further, and the tributary to the east was moving faster than the rainfall alone could justify, carrying a weight and a volume that suggested pressure building somewhere beyond what could be seen from here. And there was something else. Something that did not show itself in the water level or the color of the soil, but in the way the air held moisture longer after the rain had stopped, in the way runoff lingered instead of disappearing, in the way small depressions filled and stayed filled, even when the sky cleared for a day. These were not signs most people would notice, and even if they did, they would not know what to do with them. But Luther had been watching this ground for more than 40 years, and he had learned, slowly and without ever writing it down, that the land told the truth long before the forecasts did, and what it was telling him now was not complicated, not dramatic, not even surprising. It was inevitable. He turned and walked back toward the house, not quickly, not urgently, but with the steady pace of a man who had already begun adjusting his thinking to something that had not yet arrived. And by the time he reached the porch, he had already made a decision that, to anyone else, would have seemed premature. He went inside and picked up the phone. It rang twice before David answered. "Hey, Dad?" David said, his voice carrying the background noise of an evening in a city that operated on a different rhythm, a different set of concerns, a different understanding of what mattered in the moment. "There's a significant flood coming," Luther said, without introduction, without build-up, without the kind of conversational framing that might soften the statement or make it easier to dismiss. There was a pause on the other end. Not long. Just long enough for David to shift from casual to attentive. "What are you hearing?" he asked. "I'm not hearing it," Luther said. "I'm seeing it." Another pause, slightly longer this time. David moved somewhere quieter, the background noise fading. "The Weather Service hasn't issued anything major yet," he said, choosing his words carefully, not because he doubted his father entirely, but because the information he trusted did not yet match what he was being told. "They will," Luther said, and there was no edge in his voice, no urgency, no attempt to convince, just a statement delivered with the same quiet certainty he used when describing the condition of a fence line or the timing of a harvest. David exhaled slowly. "How bad are you thinking?" he asked. Luther stepped back onto the porch as he answered, looking out over the same field he had just crossed, the same ground that now held more water than it should have, the same space that would soon be asked to carry more than it had in decades. "Bad enough that you and Carol should know I'm ready for it," he said. There was something in that phrasing that caught David's attention. Not the word flood, the word ready. "What do you mean ready?" he asked. Luther did not answer immediately, because the answer to that question did not begin in June of 1993. It did not begin with rainfall or river levels or weather reports. It began years earlier in a decision that had never fully made sense to anyone who had watched him make it, a decision that had been questioned, joked about, explained away, and eventually dismissed as something that did not really matter. "I mean, the farm is prepared," Luther said finally. David was quiet again, and this time the silence carried something else, something closer to skepticism than concern. Not dismissive, not disrespectful, but rooted in a different way of understanding risk, one that depended on official warnings and visible evidence rather than the slow accumulation of observation over time. "Dad," he said, "you've had floods before and it's never been like that." Luther nodded to himself, because that was true. It had never been like this. "Not yet," he said. The words sat there for a moment, heavier than they sounded, and David did not respond immediately, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was deciding whether this was something that required action or something that would pass the way most warnings did, quietly and without consequence. "I'll keep an eye on it from here," David said eventually. "If anything changes, you call me, all right?" "I will," Luther said. He hung up the phone and set it back in its place, then stepped outside again and sat down in the same chair he would occupy weeks later when the water finally arrived. And for a long time he did nothing but watch the field in front of him, not because there was anything dramatic happening yet, but because what mattered had already happened in a way that no one else had recognized. Because somewhere in the space between what the land was showing and what people were willing to believe, there was a gap, and Luther Finch had already built something to close it. The question was not whether the flood would come. The question was whether what he had built years before, when no one was asking him to, when no one thought it was necessary, when even his own family could not understand why he was doing it, would still hold when it finally did. And as the first heavy rains of June settled into the ground that was already too full to take them, there was one detail, small and easily overlooked, that would end up mattering more than anything else. Not the amount of water, not the speed of the river, but the exact way that water chose its path once it had nowhere left to go. 4 years earlier, on a hot morning in May 1989, in the same field that would one day carry floodwater across its surface, Luther Finch stepped off his porch with a spade in his hand and walked to a section of ground that, to anyone else, looked no different from the rest of the property, but to him had already been marked, measured, and understood in a way that had taken years to develop and even longer to trust. He had not arrived at that spot by accident, and he had not decided to start digging on impulse. because the work he was about to begin had been forming slowly since the smaller flood of 1982, the one that had put 6 inches of water into his barn and left it there long enough to damage everything at floor level, long enough to force him into repairs that cost more than the inconvenience suggested they should, and long enough to show him something he had not fully understood before, which was that the water itself was not the problem. The way it moved across his land was. In the years that followed, he began to watch differently. Not casually, and not only during storms, but deliberately, with the kind of attention that turns ordinary events into information. And every time it rained, he paid attention to where the water gathered first, where it lingered, where it moved quickly, and where it slowed down as if meeting resistance that could not be seen from above, and he noticed that the same patterns repeated themselves with a consistency that most people would have overlooked, because they were not dramatic, not obvious, and not immediately useful unless you were willing to observe them over time. He marked those patterns in small ways at first, placing stakes in the ground, making notes that existed mostly in his head, walking the same sections of the field after every rain to confirm what he thought he was seeing, and over time, those small observations began to form something larger, something that resembled a map, not drawn on paper but held in memory. A map of how water behaved on this specific piece of land under different conditions, at different intensities, across different seasons. By 1988, that map was complete enough that he could stand in one place and predict, with a level of confidence he did not need to explain to anyone else, where water would go before it got there, and more importantly, how it could be guided if the ground was shaped in a way that worked with those natural tendencies instead of against them. So, when he placed the blade of the spade into the soil that morning in May, he was not experimenting. He was beginning something he already understood. The first cut was shallow, deliberate, more about confirming the line than making progress, and he worked slowly, removing soil in measured amounts, placing it to the side in a way that allowed him to see the developing shape of what he was creating. Because this was not a trench in the simple sense of a straight channel cut from one point to another, it was a system, a connected path that would intercept water from multiple directions, redirect it around the structures that mattered, and carry it toward a natural low point at the southwest corner of the property where it could spread out and lose force instead of building pressure. He worked 2 hours that morning, then stopped before the heat became something that would affect his judgment. And when he returned in the evening, he adjusted the line slightly based on what he had seen in the soil itself, the way it held together in some sections and broke apart in others, the way moisture settled differently at different depths, the kind of information that could not be gathered all at once and could not be rushed without losing something important. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and the trench began to take shape, not as a single visible feature, but as a series of connected lines that only made sense when viewed together, when followed from one point to the next, when understood as part of a system rather than as individual cuts in the ground. And Luther marked his progress with stakes and string lines, checking the grade with a hand level he had owned for decades, adjusting small sections as needed, sometimes reworking areas he had already completed because the ground told him something he had not anticipated. The work was slow, intentionally slow, because speed was not the objective, accuracy was. And somewhere in the middle of that first summer, when the lines of the trench had become visible enough that someone passing by could begin to recognize that something was being built, David came to visit. He found his father in the field, bent slightly at the waist, working the spade into the ground with the steady rhythm of someone who was not trying to finish quickly, but was trying to finish correctly. And he stood there for a few moments without speaking, watching in the way people do when they are trying to understand something that does not immediately make sense. Then he asked the question that anyone would have asked. "Dad, why don't you just hire someone with a trencher for this?" he said, looking out at the length of what had already been dug and the much larger length that remained. "This is going to take you all summer." Luther did not stop working as he answered. "It'll take longer than that," he said, his voice even, without frustration, without defensiveness, just a statement of fact that did not require elaboration. David looked again at the stakes, the string lines, the careful measurements, and he tried to understand what he was seeing in terms that made sense to him, terms of efficiency, of time, of effort versus outcome, and none of it aligned in a way that justified the scale of what his father was doing. "What exactly are you building?" he asked. Luther straightened slightly, resting one hand on the handle of the spade as he looked out across the lines he had already cut into the ground, and for a moment he considered how much to explain, not because he could not explain it, but because he knew from experience that explanations like this required a certain kind of attention to be understood, and not everyone was interested in giving it. "A way to move water," he said. David waited, because that answer was not enough. Luther added a few more details describing how the trench would intercept runoff from the north and east, how it would carry it around the barn instead of allowing it to collect against the foundation, how it would release it into a part of the field that could absorb it without damage. And as he spoke, David followed the logic without fully accepting the necessity, because the scale of the effort still seemed disproportionate to the problem as he understood it. And when people encounter that kind of imbalance, when effort appears greater than the risk it is meant to address, they tend to respond in a way that softens their concern without dismissing it entirely. They use humor. "So you're building a moat," David said, smiling slightly as he said it, not intending to insult, not intending to undermine, but trying to fit what he was seeing into a category that made it easier to accept. Luther did not respond to the word. He did not correct it. He did not agree with it. He simply returned to his work. And that was the moment, small and easily overlooked, when something began that would continue for the next 4 years, not the trench itself, because that continued regardless, but the way people would talk about it, the way they would frame it, the way they would understand it without ever fully seeing what it was designed to do. Because once something is named in a certain way, especially in a way that carries humor, it becomes easier to repeat than to reconsider. And the trench, from that day forward, was no longer just a system designed to move water. It was Luther Finch's moat. The question was not whether he would finish it. He would. The question was whether anyone would understand it before it had to prove itself. And more importantly, whether it would still work the way he intended when that moment finally came. July 1993. The flood arrived not all at once, but gradually, building over 3 days, creeping through the Merrimack River Valley like a tide that no one could resist. Yet for Luther Finch, it was a tide he had already anticipated. On day 1, the tributary rose steadily to its banks. Luther moved his equipment to the highest ground on his property. The barn and outbuildings rested on a slight natural rise he had chosen in 1951, and for the first time in 4 years, the preparation of 800 hours felt alive in the reality of moving water. Day 2, the tributary overflowed. Water spread across the floodplain with a silent, insistent pressure. Luther sat on his porch and watched it come. He could see the first sheets of water reach the north perimeter of his property and meet the initial section of his trench system. The channels were narrow, shallow, and precise. He could see the water enter, follow the grade, bend around the corner as he had designed it, and flow past the barn rather than toward it. It followed the lines he had marked with stakes, the grades he had leveled with his hand tools, the minor adjustments he had made when the ground told him to shift a spade, a wheelbarrow, a shovel. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel relief. He felt something quieter than either of those, a steady satisfaction that comes when a plan executed slowly and carefully works exactly as intended. He observed the water move along the channels. He noticed a small puddle forming at the southwest low point, then disappearing, absorbed into the field. He heard the muted swish of moving water, the soft scrape of soil as the flood followed the path he had carved decades of observation into, the smell of wet Missouri clay rising in the warm July air. On day 3, the flood peaked. Luther could see Raymond Cole's barn to the north, 18 inches of water against the siding. The structure survived, but everything stored at floor-level tools, feed, equipment was destroyed. He watched a tractor shed 2 farms further north collapse entirely as the force of the water tore at its weak foundation. And through it all, his barn was dry, not mostly dry, not an inch of water across the threshold. The doors remained closed, the floorboards intact, the hay stored inside untouched by the rising water. He observed debris floating past the trench, sticks, leaves, even small logs caught in the channels he had dug. They moved precisely where he had anticipated, following the bends and grades he had laboriously shaped over hundreds of hours. He saw the swirling eddies around the corners, and for a brief moment allowed himself a quiet smile at the simple mathematics of gravity, slope, and patient work. He did not shout. He did not move toward the water. He did not signal to anyone. He had already done what needed doing years ago on summer mornings and evenings when no one watched. The flood was not chaos to him. It was a slow, deliberate confirmation, a silent proof of foresight, and he let it unfold calmly, like a man watching a piece of art he had created decades before, finally revealed in full. The micro-loops of his mind traced every detail, the northwest corner of the barn, where water would have pooled if he had not dug a slight depression. The east side, where he had reinforced the grade after observing minor ponding in 1988. The southwest exit, where he had ensured that even the heaviest rainfall from upstream would leave his property without harm. Each observation reinforced his quiet certainty, and he felt a deep satisfaction, almost reverence, for the work of foresight done long before the emergency arrived. 3 days after the flood peaked, when the roads were finally passable, David and Carol drove out from St. Louis and Jefferson City. They had been calling every day, listening to their father's calm voice on the phone. He had said he was fine, but neither of them fully believed him. They pulled into the driveway. The first thing they saw was the barn, standing, undamaged, its doors closed, the siding intact, the roof untouched by the rising waters. The property around it told a story: wet soil, debris lines, the paths where the trenches had carried the water, but the structures themselves remained untouched. David got out first. He approached the barn and opened the door. The floor was dry, perfectly dry. Everything inside was exactly as it had been stored weeks before. He stood there, breathing slowly, taking in the weight of what had happened. Carol walked the north trench line. Her eyes traced it from the property boundary to where it curved around the barn foundation. She had seen this trench many times over the years. Only now did she understand its purpose. She followed the water's path in her mind, the grades, the angles, the countless hours of labor. Then she found Luther on the porch. He sat in his chair, quiet, watching the fields, the barn, and the flow lines in the soil. She sat beside him. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, she said, "I called it a medieval fortress." Luther's eyes followed the line of the trenches. "You weren't wrong," he said quietly. "That's more or less what it is." Carol's voice caught slightly. "I'm sorry, Dad. We laughed at you for 4 years." Luther remained silent. Then he said, "You were worried about me. There's a difference." David came and sat on the other side. The three of them stayed on the porch, looking at the wet fields, the barn, the trench paths. For a long while, no one spoke. That silence, heavy with understanding, became the emotional payoff of the entire story. 2 weeks after the flood, Raymond Cole arrived at Luther's fence line. He had spent days dealing with damage to his own barn, handling insurance claims, coordinating cleanup. He looked at Luther's trench system. He traced it with his eyes, finally seeing its intent and precision. Then he asked Luther to explain how it worked. Luther came out. He walked the trench with him. He pointed to the grades, the interception points, the natural low point at the southwest corner. He explained how the flow capacity was calculated based on the largest rainfall he had ever observed on the property. Cole listened, carefully. "How long did this take you?" he asked. Luther thought for a moment. "About 800 hours, he said. Cole was quiet. "I thought you were wasting your time," he admitted. Luther nodded. "I know," he said simply. Cole looked across his own property. He saw the damage, the barn with its stained walls, the watermarks. "How do I start?" he asked finally. Luther looked at him. The sun reflected off the wet soil, the trenches carved into the land. He said, "With a spade, and you go slow." Cole nodded. He let it sink in. He realized the patience it would take, the care, the attention to detail. Luther walked him back to the porch. He left Cole to digest the lesson of preparation, foresight, and the quiet power of work done carefully over time. This version adds breathing room, shorter connected sentences, natural micro-pauses, and expanded descriptive beats to make it more cinematic and human. Luther Finch farmed until he was 79 years old. His son David took over the farm after his father passed. The first thing he did was walk the entire trench system, notebook in hand, every section, every grade marker, every interception point. He wanted to understand it completely, to make sure nothing of his father's work would be lost. Then he extended it. He hired a contractor, but he directed every inch himself, following his father's maps and notes. Precision was everything. Every slope, every curve, every drainage point. Nothing could be left to chance. The farm flooded twice after 1993, once in 2008, and again in 2019. Both times, the barn remained dry. Every inch of water moved exactly along the channels Luther had dug by hand. It flowed around the structures, leaving the farm intact. Meanwhile, neighboring properties suffered. In 2019, Luther's grandson stood on the porch, the same teenager who had listened seriously while David rolled his eyes in 1992. He watched the water move through the trench system, exactly as his grandfather had designed it. He called his father from the porch. "It's working, Dad," he said. David replied, "I know." For a long moment they both watched in silence. They understood something. The most important work had been done decades ago. Quietly, without recognition, with patience and observation guiding every step. The legacy was more than the barn. It was the knowledge, the method, the meticulous attention to detail. It allowed a family, a farm, and a community to endure a flood that had destroyed so much else. Every stake, every grade, every carefully measured slope, a testament to Luther Finch's foresight, a lesson for the next generation, the quiet power of preparation. This story is unlike any we've told before. It is not about a rival. It is not about a single dramatic rescue. It is not about proving someone wrong. It is about observation and preparation. Luther Finch did not build his trench system to show off. He did not build it to impress. He built it because he watched. For 40 years, every rainfall, every shift in the river, every inch of ground on his farm, he understood what water would do, and he acted. Slowly, carefully, over hundreds of hours, by hand. Each spade of soil moved was a prediction tested against reality. Each grade marker placed was a decision confirmed by the flow of water over time. The flood in 1993 did not surprise him. He was ready. His neighbors were not. The barns around him were underwater, their owners scrambling, their equipment ruined, their livestock at risk. Yet Luther's barn stood, not by luck, not by chance, not because someone whispered a warning, but because of foresight, because of attention, because of work done quietly over years when no one was watching. The most important action did not happen on the day of the flood. It happened in 1989, in the hundreds of hours spent with a spade, moving soil, testing grades, adjusting the trenches, learning from the ground itself, observing how the water pooled after a rain, how it flowed across the flat areas, where it gathered and where it ran off. That is where the barn was saved. That is where the crisis became manageable. That is where the real lesson lies. Preparation is invisible. Patience is quiet. Dedication is measured in hours, not applause. The work that matters most is often the work that no one notices until the moment it is tested. Luther's barn did not need heroics. It needed foresight. It needed understanding. And it needed time. When the floodwaters arrived, Luther watched. He did not panic. He did not rush. He observed the water as it entered the first trench. He followed it as it curved around the barn and flowed to the low point he had chosen decades before. Every turn, every slope, every interception point worked exactly as he had intended. He did not feel triumph. He did not even feel relief. He felt the quiet satisfaction of a thing functioning precisely as it was meant to. The world will test you. Systems will fail. People will scramble. Events will arrive that you cannot control. The flood will come. The river will rise. Machines will break. Power will falter. But if you pay attention over time, if you act when others cannot see the need, if you prepare quietly and thoroughly, you will endure. You will survive. You will leave a legacy that speaks louder than words. The lesson for those who see this is simple, yet profound. Success is not always about speed. It is not always about scale. It is not about impressing others or winning their approval. Success is about understanding, about preparation, about doing the small, quiet work that shapes outcomes before anyone else is aware of the challenge. Luther Finch's barn did not survive the flood because he was lucky. It survived because he respected the problem long before it became obvious. And now that barn stands, not as a monument to heroics, but as a testament to observation, patience, and the quiet power of preparation. And every time the wind moves through the trees, every time the rain falls and the water finds its way through the trenches, it reminds us that the work that matters most is often invisible. If this story stayed with you, there is something you can do right now that costs nothing. Hit the subscribe button below. Every week on The Last Acre, we tell stories of people who quietly prepared, who acted with foresight, who built something lasting before anyone noticed. Stories of decisions that saved lives, property, and legacies. If you have ever quietly prepared for something that others doubted, tell us about it in the comments. That kind of patience, that kind of foresight belongs here too.